So far in our study of the background of the New Testament writings, we've covered the majority of the Old Testament story. I won't rehearse that all right now. If you've been part of the class, or perhaps through your own Bible study, you know most of that history. But we've rehearsed those things because they are key to understanding the New Testament, tracing the story of course, the descendants of Abraham as they moved forward in the plan of God to bring about the Messiah. For the most part, we've moved up to the point in Old Testament history where the southern kingdom of Judah was finally taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. We're just about to move into what's known as the intertestamental period, those 400 or so years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. But as we move into that period of time, which is vital as well to understanding the New Testament, there is yet a bit of Bible-related material that we do need to cover. The intertestamental period, of course, was prefaced by times of national upheaval in which the southern kingdom of Judah was involved. It's easy to kind of get locked into that Old Testament story of Israel and the people of God and kind of forget that there's other things going on in the world. And of course, the tiny nation or the tiny land of Israel, where God's people lived, was kind of at the crossroads of a lot of international warring and intrigue. By the time we reach the closing years of the 7th century BC, or the 600s BC, the dominion of Egyptian and Assyrian empires, they were beginning to wane. Assyria, of course, in the north and east of the land of Israel, and of course, Egypt to the south, were two of the dominant world forces in the 7th century BC. But that was shortly to change. The turning point, of course, in history, the world history, is what's known as the Battle of Carchemish. Throughout time, there have been battles between nations that have changed the course of history in a lot of ways. Even the United States of America have had those kind of battles. You think back to D-Day in World War II. Depending on how that would have changed world history, and it did. Thankfully, we were on the side that was triumphant in that particular battle. But there were those kind of battles in the Civil War and World War I, and on it goes. But as far as the 7th century BC, this Battle of Carchemish, it was fought in May and June of 605 BC between the allied army of the Egyptians and the Assyrians against the Babylonians. While the Assyrians and the Egyptians were kind of the established powers, although they were on the decline, Babylon was the up-and-coming force. And the Babylonians were exerting their influence in trying to defeat the Assyrians and the Egyptians. So those tensions kind of came to a head there in 605 BC in what we're calling what's called the Battle of Carchemish. Just a little bit of background to this. You may be familiar with it, but you may not. When the Assyrian capital of Nineveh was overrun by the Babylonians in 612 BC, the Assyrians moved their capital to Haran, which is now in modern-day Turkey. When the Babylonians captured Haran in 608 BC, the Assyrian capital was moved to Carchemish. So you kind of get a hint here of what's going on. The Egyptians are making a push, and the Babylonians rather were making a push against Assyria, and Assyria was in retreat. Egypt, of course, was allied with the Assyrians against the Babylonians, and they got word, of course, of the trouble that Assyria was in. So the Egyptians marched north through Israel to the aid of the Assyrians against the Babylonians. In 609 BC, the Egyptian army of Pharaoh Necho II was delayed at Megiddo in Israel. Here's where world history and Old Testament history intersect. Pharaoh, on his way north to help out the Assyrians, encounters the armies of Israel, or the armies of Judah, under King Josiah. And Bible history records that King Josiah was killed and his army was defeated. Let me just read a little of that history from the Old Testament. In one place it's mentioned is 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 28 through 30. 2 Kings 23, verses 28 through 30. It says, "Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah in his days, or in the days of King Josiah? Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went out to meet him. And when Pharaoh Necho saw him, and he killed him at, he says he killed him at Megiddo. His servants drove his body in a chariot from Megiddo and brought it to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. Then the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in place of his father." If you go on, we won't take time to read it right now, but you can read in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verses 20 through 24, and Jeremiah 46, verses 1 and 2. Jeremiah, of course, was prophesying in the middle of these times, but Josiah had been warned by Pharaoh Necho not to interfere, but he did anyway, and it cost him his life. But that's what's going on at this time in history. The Egyptians, of course, after the Battle of Megiddo, fighting against Israel, were further delayed at Riblah, and Necho arrived finally at Carchemish too late. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had surprised the Assyrians, and he had captured Carchemish. He then turned on the Egyptians and thoroughly defeated them in a bloody battle. This is the Battle of Carchemish, and the combined Egyptian and Assyrian forces were devastated. So, if you will, Assyria finally subjugated to the Babylonians, and the Egyptians as well defeated, and their remnant make their way back toward Egypt. Before the Battle of Carchemish, Egypt had one of the greatest armies in northern Africa and was a threat to the Middle East. But the Battle of Carchemish changed all that when the Babylonians destroyed the power of Egypt and the independent existence of Assyria. The Battle of Carchemish was the end of the Assyrian Empire, and Egypt was reduced to a second-rate power. Babylon became master of the Middle East. So that's just a little bit of a background, again, to the demise of Assyria and Egypt, and the rising to the stage of these Babylonians at right near the end of the 7th century. And again, we find Israel caught up in this. After defeating the Assyrians and the Egyptians, King Nebuchadnezzar kind of set his eyes on the land of Israel. And we learn from the Bible that King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army made 3 visits to Jerusalem and Judea. The first one was in 605, and if you've kind of been keeping track of those dates as we've gone along, it's not a long time after what happened at Carchemish. But let's notice the Bible history of what happened this first time King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians made their way to Jerusalem and Judea. 2 Kings chapter 24 this time. I will read verses 1 through 9. 2 Kings 24, 1 through 9. It says, "In his days," and if you jump back to the end of chapter 23, we find speaks of Jehoiakim becoming king. It says, "In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. The Lord sent against him bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites. So he sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. Surely at the command of the Lord, it came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all he had done, and also for the innocent blood which he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not forgive. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, became king in his place." Notice what it says here in verse 7. "The king of Egypt did not come out of his land again, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. That's just the history we talked about a few moments ago. Verse 8, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father had done. So again, this is the first time Nebuchadnezzar here is exerting his influence over the kings of Judah in this particular visit. And we do know from other Bible history, places like Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it was during this first visit of Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, or to Jerusalem rather, that Nebuchadnezzar took many of the finest and brightest young men from each city in Judah captive, including Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and you probably know them better by their other names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those 4 young Hebrew men, as again, many others of the best and the brightest, were taken back to Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar after this visit. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 will speak to this at all, talking about this same time frame. So that's visit number 1. But it's not to last. Starting in verse 10 here of 2 Kings 24, in 597 BC, some 7, 8 years later, we find some intrigue going on in Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar has to come back and re-exert his power and authority over this part of his realm. Let's read on. 2 Kings 24, starting in verse 10. It says, at that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his captains and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried out from there, speaking of Nebuchadnezzar and his army, he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem and all captains and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So he led Jehoiachin, that's the king at this point, away into exile to Babylon. Also the king's mother and the king's wives and his officials and the leading men of the land he led away into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the men of valor, 7,000, and the craftsmen and the smiths, 1,000, all strong and fit for war. And these the king of Babylon brought into exile to Babylon. Then the king of Babylon made his uncle Mattaniah king in his place, king in Jerusalem, puppet king, if you will. And he changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king and reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For through the anger of the Lord, this came about in Jerusalem and Judea until he cast them out of his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So again, this second visit. Here, more of the royal entourage is taken captive, and these craftsmen, mighty men, just the poorest of the poor left in the land. Again, due to the rebellion of those who should have been listening. If you study the book of Jeremiah, you'll know that God prophesied through him that these people should submit to this judgment of God through the Babylonians, but they continue to try to rebel. That was 597, visit number 2. There's Nebuchadnezzar is going to come to Jerusalem one more time, and this time he's going to finish the job, if you will. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and his army return once more, and at this point they destroy the city and destroy the temple itself. Let's read that history in 2 Kings 25. 2 Kings 25, verses 1 through 12. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar has set up Zedekiah here to be king. He's supposed to do the will of Nebuchadnezzar, but Zedekiah rather here is going to rebel and pay the price. Excuse me. Now in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, camped against it, and built a siege wall around it. So the city was under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food, the city here being Jerusalem. There was no food for the people of the land. Then the city was broken into, and all the men of war fled by night by way of the gate between the two walls, beside the king's garden, though all the Chaldeans were all around the city, and they went by way of the Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and he passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, then put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him with bronze fetters and brought him to Babylon. Now on the 7th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, speaking there of the temple, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house he burned with fire. So all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Then the rest of the people who were left in the city and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, to the rest of the people, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried them away into exile. The captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. So again, the biblical history here dovetailing in with the secular history of the time. Nebuchadnezzar on the rise, doing battle with other world empires. Judah here caught in the crosshairs of much of that. God, of course, we know from Bible history, brought this judgment through Babylon upon his people. Now God eventually will judge Babylon for their deeds. But this is the history. 605 BC, 597 BC, finally in 586 BC, again, the final straw or final thing falls and the city is destroyed. This Babylonian exile, most of Judah went into exile to Nebuchadnezzar, would last for 70 years according to the prophets. Jeremiah 25 verses 8 through 11 and Jeremiah 29 verses 1 through 11. Jeremiah there talks about how God said, you're going to bear the brunt of this discipline for 70 years, 7 decades. Judah would be in chains in that sense of the term. Let's look at Jeremiah 25. Jeremiah 25, we'll be reading verses 8 through 11. Notice the history recorded here again within the pages of the Bible of what's going on. Jeremiah 25 says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all these nations round about, and I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, and the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp." Again, so God here is prophesying through Jeremiah, says, Nebuchadnezzar has his plans, but ultimately I'm the one bringing him against my people, Judah in this case, for punishment for their sin. But notice verse 11, Jeremiah 25:11 says, "This whole land, the land of Judah, the land of Israel, if you will, This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. All right, so there will be an end to this. And again, you can go on and read Jeremiah 29, 1 through 11, and 2 Chronicles 36, verses 11 through 23, and read more about this specific time frame. So things were looking bad. We mentioned in previous classes, it's been about 150 years earlier that the Assyrians, who were dominant at that time, took the northern kingdom of Israel captive to Assyria. Now Judah, because of her own sin, is following the footsteps of her older sister, if you will, as the Bible speaks of them in places. And now she's bearing the brunt of her own punishment, but there will be an end to it. Let's go on again and talk more about world history of this time. We're setting the stage for, again, the intertestamental period. Another power was on the rise as well. You know, the Babylonians had their time on the world stage of national dominance. But something known as the Medo-Persian Empire eventually displaced the Babylonians as the dominant regional power of the day. Medo-Persian, and you'll find that in the pages of the Bible as well. In fact, the prophet Daniel, who you recall was one of those captives taken to Babylon, God used him even in captivity to continue to speak of his work in world history. You may recall what we can read in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, if you know your Bible history, if you know your Old Testament, you know Daniel chapter 2 is that vision that King Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue, the massive statue made out of various metals. And let's read some of that as it happened. Of course, the king has his dream, and his own magicians or soothsayers or conjurers can't tell him either the dream or the interpretation of it. Daniel, of course, is empowered by God to do it. But you get to verse 31, and notice how Daniel describes the dream or vision that Nebuchadnezzar has at that particular time. Daniel says, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay." All right, so there you've got the picture of this image. Daniel says to the king, he says, "You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. The stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Amazing dream, but it still doesn't tell the king, what it means. And that's, of course, what Nebuchadnezzar wants to know. So Daniel's going to go on again by the power of God to reveal that. Verse 36, Daniel says, "This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, King Nebuchadnezzar, are a king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And whenever or wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold." And if you read on the book of Daniel, that God is going to humble Nebuchadnezzar for his own pride. And right here, Daniel is reminding him that for all of his, rise to the preeminence in the world around him, it was, of course, God who had given him all of that. But he's this head of gold. That's what's represented in the vision in the statue. But let's move on down the statue to the other metals. Daniel says in verse 38, we skipped one. All right. After you, no, we didn't. Okay, we got Babylon is the first nation represented. Verse 38, after you, okay. After you, there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which will rise over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron, it breaks into pieces. It will crush and break all these into pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay, and the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so that some of the kingdoms will be strong and part will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Of course, the most important part for Bible students and those concerned with what God is doing in the world, in verse 44 and 45, it says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven, and in context, it's in the days of that fourth kingdom, you've got God doing something amazing then. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left to another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. If you trace out world history, and Daniel said clearly that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian empire, was the head of gold. If you trace on down in world history, the next three kingdoms in a row after that were the Medo-Persians. They were the ones that took over from the Babylonians. Then you've got the Greeks, or the Grecians, under Alexander the Great. They conquered the Medo-Persian Empire. And of course, it was the Romans who took the stage after the fall of the Greek Empire as well. So the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. And of course, in the days of those Roman kings, God did indeed set up a kingdom, God's spiritual kingdom, inaugurated by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, of course. Prophecy was fulfilled just as the Bible said. A little bit of history from a website that I ran across, and this is, of course, Bible history as far as the Medo-Persians coming in and displacing the Babylonians. You've got that history later in the book of Daniel. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar, is kind of the guy in charge in the first half, and then about the middle of the book of Daniel, you've got the Medo-Persians, of course, coming in and taking over Babylon. Here's what one site had to say. It says the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had died in 562 BC, and his death had precipitated the rapid decline of his empire. His reign was followed in quick succession by the reigns of someone named Evil-Merodach, Neriglissar, and Labasi Marduk, before any semblance of stability was reached with the reign of Nabonidus. Even under Nabonidus, there was trouble because of religious controversies. Due to these problems, Nabonidus was absent from the capital for lengthy periods of time. His son Belshazzar, and that's the name that comes up with the demise of the Babylonian Empire in the book of Daniel. His son Belshazzar was the effective ruler of Babylon during these periods. In 539 BC, Belshazzar was present in the city when Babylon fell to Cyrus, the leader of the Persians, all right? 539 BC. Belshazzar, of course, in the book of Daniel, was the one, I believe, that saw the handwriting on the wall from God. The book of Daniel, of course, records some of the history of this transition between the Medo-Persians and the Babylonians. A while ago, we spoke, of course, of the return of the exiles. God had promised that they would be in Babylonian exile for 70 years. And of course, if you've noticed some of those time frames, you've got that happening just exactly. You've got the conquering of the Babylonians right around 539, 540 BC. And so you've got it fulfilled in 70 years, just as God said it would. Again, Bible history wise, the return of the exiles was marked by these varying emotions and struggles. It wasn't all, strawberries and cream. There were struggles to go with it. Ezra, the book of Ezra, is a post-exilic prophet. That book records much of the history of the time we're talking about right now. This King Cyrus of the Medo-Persians had a policy, it was kind of unusual for his time, of allowing captive peoples to return to their homelands. Usually a conquering nation would come in and just keep the slaves of the previous group, but Cyrus was unusual in that he had a habit of letting them go. So in 538 BC, following his conquering of Babylon in 539, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the exiled Jews to return to Judah. That's in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. So Ezra was one of the men of God who led that first wave of exiles to go back to Israel or Judah. It says tens of thousands returned with Zerubbabel and Joshua, but an even larger number remained behind, not willing to give up, the life that they had established in Babylon over the previous decades. You can read about that history in Ezra chapter 2. Those who did return to the land, of course, faced many hardships. You know that part of the Bible story as well. There were surrounding peoples in Israel of Judah at that particular time that continued to be a thorn in the side of those who'd come to rebuild the city. Those who did return to the land were faced with numerous hardships. The land was in poor shape for farming, and many of the buildings were in need of repairs. In addition, the Jews who remained in Judah had taken the land of those who had been exiled. Furthermore, Judah's neighbors were adamantly opposed to the rebuilding program. All of this caused widespread discouragement. Thus, after rebuilding the altar in 537, that's in Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and preparing for the foundation of the temple in 536 BC, Ezra 3, verses 8 through 13, opposition and despair caused the work to come to a standstill for over 15 years. And you can read about that in Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. But after much work, the temple was finally completed in 515 BC. In Persia, Darius's lengthy reign, this is another leader of Persia, was followed by that of Xerxes, and then by Artaxerxes. And of course, those names come up in the story of Esther, don't they? It was during the reign of Artaxerxes that Ezra led a second group of returnees to Judah in 458 BC. Nehemiah, of course, of Bible fame in Old Testament history, Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem with a third group of returnees in 445 to finish rebuilding the wall of the city. Nehemiah then returned to Persia in 433. The ministry of the prophet of Malachi, which you're familiar, that's the last book in the Old Testament record. The ministry of the prophet Malachi likely occurred sometime in this period, soon after Nehemiah's departure, but before his second visit. And that's in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6. I mentioned just a moment ago that these returnees, as they came back from Babylon after 70 decades, there, of course, were some who were older that remembered what it was like before. Of course, there were some born in Babylon that came back that didn't have the same expectations. And I want to close our study in this particular part with a verse from Ezra chapter 3, verse 12. Ezra chapter 3 and verse 12 kind of summarizes this varying emotions that the returnees from exile were faced with. It says there, yet many of the priests and Levites and the heads of the father's household, the old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, speaking of the temple, while many others shouted aloud for joy. And that kind of catches the gist of the picture we're trying to paint here. This rebuilt temple, at least at this stage, was a far cry from what the people remembered of Solomon's temple, the temple that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, a glorious thing according to even secular accounts of its day. But Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it, and there were those who could remember that, and standing there amidst the rubble, the city of Jerusalem, they're endeavoring to rebuild the city and the temple and the walls, and they're laying the foundation of the temple. But these older people weep because of what they recall. Again, some of the younger ones saying, well, all right, let's go. They had not that memory. So a lot of emotion and coming from various different directions. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of the Bible history of just prior to the intertestamental period. That sets the stage for our study from this point on, where again, we're not going to have biblical references for the next 400 years of history. There, some 400 years expired between the time of Malachi and the opening of the New Testament, but much happened in the world as well as within the people of God that still contributes to the background and the understanding we have of the New Testament. And Lord willing, over the next few lessons, we'll continue to take a look at that as we go on in our study. God bless, and hope that this has been beneficial to you. Go on, listen to the lesson again if you need to slow down and take some time for the references, but I would encourage you to think about this as we get ready to move on. God bless.